This happened in the spring of 2019 when I was 24. My older brother, Lucas, and I decided to go on a camping trip in rural Colorado. We'd always been really close, but with the craziness of everyday life, it had been almost 2 years since we'd spent any quality time together. We found this spot on a camping forum on Reddit. It was a wooded area near a small town called Leadville. According to the post, there was a hidden lake about a 40-minute hike away, and the place was practically unknown to tourists. We left Denver on a Friday morning and got there around 4 in the afternoon. The dirt road leading to the camping spot was pretty rough, full of potholes and loose rocks. My car struggled a bit, but we made it. The place was exactly like the photos showed. A clearing surrounded by huge pine trees, with a stream running about 150 feet away. There was nobody there, which was perfect for us. We set up our tents side by side, made a campfire, and spent the night talking about life, drinking beer, and roasting marshmallows. It was a peaceful night. I remember falling asleep around 11:30, exhausted from the drive. I woke up in the middle of the night with Lucas shaking me. He had his phone flashlight on and looked genuinely scared. I asked what happened, and he said he'd heard someone walking around the tents. I stayed silent for about 30 seconds, trying to hear something, but I heard nothing. I told him it was probably just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Human footsteps. Slow and deliberate, like someone was circling our campsite. The sound would stop for a few seconds and then start again. Lucas looked at me with wide eyes, and I knew he was hearing it too. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. I shined the light around the area and didn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued. The problem was they seemed to be coming from all directions at once, like there was more than one person out there. I called out loud, asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was almost worse than the footsteps. It was a heavy silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Lucas came out of his tent and stood next to me. We stood there back to back, shining our flashlights into the darkness for about 5 minutes. When we finally decided it was safe to go back to our tents, I saw it. There was someone standing among the trees, maybe about 100 feet away. It was a dark silhouette, completely still. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but the light didn't reach that far. I nudged Lucas and pointed. He saw it too. We stared at that figure for about 20 seconds that felt like an eternity. And then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It kind of slid backwards, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. It didn't make a sound. We didn't need to discuss it. We started throwing everything into the car without even properly taking down the tents. We were out of there in less than 10 minutes. The entire way back down the dirt road, I swear I saw more silhouettes standing among the trees, briefly illuminated by the car's headlights. Lucas said he didn't see anything, but I know what I saw. We never went back to that place. And the strangest thing is that a few weeks later, I tried to find that Reddit post to leave a warning for others. The post had been deleted, and the account that had posted it no longer existed. Story 2. My name is Sarah, and this happened in March 2021. I had just turned 26 and was going through a really rough patch. I had ended a 5-year relationship and needed some time alone to reconnect with myself. A friend suggested I do a solo camping retreat, said it had done wonders for her mental health. So that's what I did. I chose a structured campground in rural Oregon, near Bend. It wasn't anything too isolated. It had bathrooms, a small snack bar, and other campers nearby. I figured it would be safe enough for a woman alone. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon and set up my tent in a more secluded corner, near a wooden fence that separated the campground from a dense wooded area. The first 2 days were amazing. I went hiking, read a lot, cooked my own meals on the camp stove. There were about 4 or 5 other groups camping there, but everyone kept a respectful distance. On Saturday night, though, things started getting strange. I was sitting near my campfire when I noticed a man watching me. He was standing near one of the tents on the other side of the campground, but he was clearly looking in my direction. It wasn't a casual glance. It was fixed, intense. I looked away and pretended I hadn't noticed. But when I looked again, a few minutes later, he was still there. Same position, staring at me. I decided to go into my tent early that night. I locked the zipper with a small padlock I had brought and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off for a few hours because I woke up to the sound of someone messing with the wooden fence behind my tent. It was a scratching sound, like someone was running their hand along the wood repeatedly. I was paralyzed. The sound continued for about 2 minutes and then stopped. I was almost convincing myself it was an animal when I heard a voice. It was a whisper, so low I could barely understand it. But I swear, I heard my name. Sarah, whispered right next to the tent fabric. I didn't sleep anymore that night. I stayed curled up in my sleeping bag, holding my pocket knife, waiting for the sun to rise. As soon as it got light, I got out of the tent and looked around. There was nobody nearby. But when I went to the wooden fence, I saw something written on it. Letters scratched into the wood, like they had been made with a knife or rock. It said, "I know you're alone." I took down my tent in record time and went to the campground snack bar to tell the owner. He seemed genuinely concerned and said he would check the security cameras. But when he went to check, he discovered that the cameras covering that area of the campground had stopped working the night before. I left that same day. I never found out who that man was, or if he was the one who wrote that message. The campground owner called me a week later to say he hadn't found anything suspicious, and that it was probably just a bad joke from another camper. But I know it wasn't a joke. Whoever it was knew my name, and I had never introduced myself to anyone at that campground. Story 3. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 31. My name is Mike, and I work as a software engineer in Seattle. Every year, me and a group of college friends go on a camping trip. There are 5 of us: me, Jake, Tyler, Derek, and Emma. Emma is the only woman in the group and also the most experienced camper. She practically grew up camping with her family in the Washington Mountains. That year, Emma suggested a different place. It was a wilderness camping area in rural Montana, near Glacier National Park. She said her dad had taken her there when she was a kid and it was one of the most beautiful places she'd ever seen. We trusted her judgment, so we agreed. The trip there was smooth. We arrived late Friday afternoon and found the place exactly as Emma had described. It was a natural clearing surrounded by huge pine trees with an incredible view of the mountains. We set up our tents in a circle, like we always did, and spent the night drinking and playing cards. Around midnight, Tyler said he was going for a walk to take a leak. We teased him, like always, and he disappeared into the darkness with his phone flashlight. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. We started getting worried. Jake went after him, yelling Tyler's name as he walked. About 2 minutes later, we heard Jake scream. It wasn't a startled scream. It was a scream of genuine terror. Derek, Emma, and I ran toward the sound. We found Jake, standing in the middle of a small trail, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He was looking at something on the ground. When we got closer, we saw what it was. It was Tyler's shirt. It was torn and had dark stains that looked like blood, but there was no sign of Tyler. Emma started screaming his name. Derek called 911, but there was no signal in that area. We spent the next 2 hours searching, yelling, shining lights into every corner of those woods. Nothing. Tyler had simply vanished. When the sun rose, we decided to go to the nearest town for help. The police came with tracking dogs and everything. They searched the area for 3 days. They found a few more pieces of Tyler's clothing scattered through the woods, always torn, always with those dark stains. But they never found him. The case is still open to this day. The official theory is that he was attacked by some wild animal, probably a bear or a mountain lion. But none of us believe that. Bears don't remove their victims' clothes. Bears don't scatter pieces of clothing for miles through the forest like some kind of macabre trail. We never did those camping trips again. The group kind of fell apart after that. I still talk to Jake from time to time, but Emma moved to another state and cut contact with everyone. I think she blames herself for suggesting that place. I don't blame her, but I also can't look at her without thinking about Tyler. Story 4. This was 2 years ago. I was 28 at the time, working remotely as an IT consultant out of Bozeman, Montana. The job wasn't anything special, but it paid okay. And being able to work from anywhere in the world was a huge plus for me. Unfortunately, I was going through kind of a rough patch at the time. I had just gotten divorced about 3 months earlier, and I wasn't handling it well. Nothing I tried was working, and believe me, I tried everything. It seems a little foolish and naive looking back, but at one point I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life in misery unless I did something drastic. Like go off the grid and spend a few weeks in the wilderness. Type drastic. So that's kind of what I did. Camping has always been a big part of my life, so trekking out in the wilderness all alone isn't actually as crazy as it sounds, at least for me. I'm actually a lifelong scout. Couldn't make Eagle quite in time. But the point is, I know my way around wilderness better than most. I've got my old man to thank for that. I didn't want to go anywhere where there'd be other people around, though. That would have defeated the whole point. I needed to be alone. So I did what any reasonable person does at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep. I went down the internet rabbit hole. Eventually, I found this old Montana backcountry camping forum that had a bunch of posts about some unofficial sites in the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. So, right then and there, I made the decision. The next morning, I planned everything out. The only person I told where I was going was my brother. And I didn't even mention the specific spot to him, just a vague description of the general area. I had a bunch of PTO saved up, so missing a week or so of work wasn't the end of the world. If I'm remembering correctly, that was a Tuesday, so it must have been a Thursday by the time I had my truck fully loaded up. I had enough supplies to last me the full week, and then some. Freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and all the other essentials. And of course my Remington 700. I'm not a gun nut or anything, but you don't go that deep into the Montana wilderness without protection from wildlife. The drive out there was about 4 hours from Bozeman. First 3.5 were easy. Highway to County Road to Forest Service Road. That last bit though, what a headache. My GPS kept trying to reroute me because the service road I needed wasn't in its system. After some painful backtracking and double-checking the descriptions of some of those online posts, I found this overgrown trail that seemed to match up with what someone had written. Twice I had to stop to move branches and other debris that were blocking the path. My truck's a decent 4x4, but I was starting to worry about getting stuck. I drove along the path until it was impossible to go any further, at which point I just shut my engine. I knew I'd have to reverse out of there when the time came to leave, but I had been prepared for that, so I wasn't too concerned. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, I was pretty confident I was in the right spot. But that far into the wilderness, there's not really a right spot since everything's as remote as everything else. Either way, I was pleased. There was a clearing not too far from the cluster of trees I had parked in front of, and it looked like a perfect place to set up camp. Except there was already a tent there. I noticed it almost immediately. It was this old olive green tent that looked like it was from the 80s. My first thought was that someone else had found those coordinates, but the tent looked like it had been there for years. There was actual mold growing on the ceiling, like visible from 20 feet away kind of mold. I walked over out of curiosity. I probably shouldn't have, but whatever. I called out a friendly hello and waited. There was no response. The zipper was partly open, so I just unzipped it the rest of the way. And let me tell you, the smell in there was god-awful. It smelled like something had died inside. The stench was unbearable. But I was in too deep and was too curious to just walk away. I looked around the tent and saw an empty sleeping bag, some soup cans, and a little notebook. I withstood the nastiness just long enough to grab the notebook and get my head back into the pure air. There wasn't anything else in the tent besides what I already mentioned, so I didn't see the need to keep investigating, but something was making that smell, which I didn't really understand. But anyway, after stepping out of the tent, I started flipping through this little notebook and immediately realized what it was. Pages and pages of tally marks. There must have been hundreds of them in there, all in groups of 7. The last page had 42 groups, which is over 8 months. I wasn't really spooked at that point, more so curious and kind of excited to have stumbled upon my own little mystery. But after flipping through the notebook a few times, there wasn't really much else to do. I ended up keeping it. What was I going to do? Return it? But anyway, I decided to set up my own camp on the opposite side of the clearing, a decent distance away from the tent, but close enough to keep an eye on it. I didn't like the thought of letting it out of my line of sight. As I settled into the spot and acclimated myself with my surroundings, I realized there were no signs that anyone had actually camped here before. I went for a pretty extensive hike and didn't find any old fire rings, trash, trails, footprints, anything that would even marginally suggest another human. It was a really clear night that night. I remember that distinctly because the stars were incredible out there. The drive and setup had exhausted me, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was, but I knew for a fact I didn't wake up to nothing. I'm a very heavy sleeper, even out in the wilderness, so I knew something was wrong. I froze in the dark and listened, trying to hear for an animal or whatever else could have woken me up. And after about 30 seconds, I heard it. Whispers. It sounded like 2 or 3 different voices. And if I had to guess, I'd say they were maybe 20 feet from my tent. They were having some kind of conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I was so freaked out I started sweating. When you go that deep in the wilderness to be alone, the last thing you're expecting to stumble upon is another person, let alone multiple people. It doesn't sound like the scariest thing per se, but in the moment, I was terrified. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, pretending to be asleep. The voices stopped, but I still didn't want to move. And after a few seconds, I started hearing footsteps around my tent. I realized whoever was out there was circling my tent the way an animal might. Instinctively, my hand went straight to my rifle, which turned out to be the correct decision, because not 2 seconds later, someone started yanking on my tent zipper. When it didn't budge, thanks to the clips I'd put on, they pulled back. I had my rifle aimed directly at the tent flap, and a very strong part of me wanted to just fire right then. I was expecting the person messing with my tent to just leave, but no. They started scratching the flap like they were trying to cut their way in, and that's what sent me over the edge. I spoke up saying I had a gun and to back the fuck off. The scratching stopped immediately. There were a few seconds of complete silence, and then I heard footsteps, multiple sets of footsteps running away in what sounded like different directions. It sounded like at least 3 people, which was somehow 10 times worse than the thought of it being just 2. They didn't all run the same way, which struck me as strange. I didn't sleep much that night, but I felt very safe with my rifle by my side. As soon as the sun rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, making a big show of brandishing my rifle. I immediately looked over at where the old moldy tent had been. It was gone. I walked over to the spot where I knew it had been. There was no ground depression, no stake holes, nothing. The grass wasn't even flattened, but I knew for a fact there had been a tent there. I had stared at it for hours the previous day. What I did find were footprints, bare human footprints, all around my campsite in a rough circle about 20 feet out. There were tons of them, and they were different sizes, which confirmed to me that there had been more than just two people out there. Some of them were also really deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time. One set of prints led over to a big pine tree at the edge of the clearing. I walked over, and that's when I saw them. Fresh cuts in the bark. I knew what they were. Tally marks. 7 groups of 7, and the start of an 8th group. Just like the notebook. I just kind of stood there trying to make sense of it. The notebook had been counting something for over 8 months, and now there were fresh marks on this tree right next to my campsite. I didn't want to think about what that meant. It gets much, much worse though, because as I was backing away from the tree, I noticed something else. It was, and still is, the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. There was a dead squirrel hanging from a low branch a few feet away, tied up with what looked like a fishing line. I'm not squeamish about dead animals. I'm a hunter, for Christ's sake. But something about the way it was positioned made me want to puke. I didn't really need any more of an indication. I immediately ran back to my campsite and started packing my stuff as fast as I could. I'll admit that my hands were actually shaking while I took down my sight, and I was having trouble focusing on the task at hand without looking over my shoulder every few seconds. After what felt like forever, I finally finished packing everything and started jogging towards my truck. I threw everything in, jumped in the truck, and started backing out. Part of me thought my tires were going to be slashed or something else, but thankfully my truck was untouched. The path was narrow and backing out was even harder than pulling in. So, the ordeal was torture. It was hell, but I made it. And I don't think I was followed. By the time I made it back home, I decided I wouldn't even bother calling anyone. I did not think there was a point. Like, realistically, what would I even report? It's not like anyone would go that far into the woods to investigate. The thing that freaks me out the most is the sight of that squirrel. No one does that unless they're trying to send a message or a threat. I honestly don't know what would have happened if I stayed another night, or if I hadn't been armed.